Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Beyond Bold. It is your host, Kyla Bolden, and thank you so much for joining me today. So, on today's episode, we have a guest, and this guest is someone that I actually went to university with, which is really, really cool. It's funny how things just come full circle, but her name is Adriana, and she is the founder of AGG Communications, which is a brand studio that helps entrepreneurs and startups build resilient businesses and navigate an evolving communications landscape. So, in short, Adriana's company is all about helping businesses find their voice and effectively communicate their why and value propositions to their customers. So, I think you guys are going to love this episode. One of the hardest things that I've learned from running my company for 8 years is effectively communicating your mission, your goals, your values to your customers. As a founder, it's really, really easy to mess up communication when it comes to speaking with your customers because everything makes sense in your mind. You're in this day in and day out. And when you go to speak to a customer, you assume that it's going to make perfect sense in their mind too because you love your product so much. You've been in it 24/7. But a lot of times that doesn't happen. So this is something that she really, really specializes in, which I think any founder really needs to learn how to effectively communicate. And this is something that Adriana does really, really well. So, in this episode, we talk about that and we also talk about her journey to entrepreneurship as well too. So, she was working a 9 to 5 and she recently, just over a year ago, quit and took the venture into entrepreneurship. So, we talk a little bit about burnout, her journey into starting her own company, and I think you guys will take a lot of really great lessons from this episode. So, let's just get into it. Thank you so much for joining me today on the Beyond Bold podcast. One of the reasons why I wanted to have you on this episode is because we talk a lot about crafting your own career at Beyond Bold. We talk a lot about thinking about your career in intentional ways, and a lot of that has to do with branding and strategy and communications. And when I found out that you were the founder of AGG Communications and kind of like the pathway that you had into becoming an entrepreneur, which, like myself, had a lot of twists and turns. I definitely wanted to have you on to talk more about it. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It's really excited to be on and to be able to touch upon those subjects. I get really excited about talking about them. So,
Absolutely. So why don't we just start off with you telling us a little bit more about your company and what you guys do?
so essentially, my work is going to companies who a lot of times know what they're doing. They start a business. Let's think about a startup or a founder, and they might just be down the process. But then when they start having to communicate their mission or what they do to other people, it gets a little bit confusing because they might be using words or technicalities that make sense to them, but don't really reach the audiences that they need to be reaching. So, in a way, kind of my goal is to be that translator to sort of understand the why of companies, understand what their mission is, what they do, how they do it, and be able to tell that story in ways that reach the audiences that they need to get to. And that can be through constructive narratives, through tailoring the storytelling elements of what angles they need to be focusing on. It can be about creating visual content to accompany it. And, you know, everything that communications implies, whether that be investor pitches, whether that be decks, whether that be social posts. So it's it's that it's that thread that allows your message to be heard to the people by the people that need to hear the most.
Yeah,
And that's from the beginning to the end of it.
absolutely. And I love that so much. So I think myself as a founder, I think about my why a lot. And it could be quite hard communicating why we do what we do and how much we want to help people because we understand it so strongly, but it does not always translate into, or rather translate to sometimes our customer or our investor or the person that we're talking about. So I really, really love what you do. And before we get into more of the nitty gritty of brand strategy and communications, I want to talk a little bit more about your entrepreneurship journey because I always love to hear about how individuals have found themselves to be entrepreneurs, have gone away from maybe like corporate life and really tried to tackle problems that they feel passionate about. So can you tell us a little bit about how this company kind of came to fruition and your pathway to that?
Absolutely. So it's so funny when you think about what's the origin, right? Because a lot of the times you can retroactively create a narrative that sort of is really tidy and it makes sense. And then it all happens like this. But in the reality, it's just sort of little things that lead you to suddenly be where you are now. So for me, the common thread, I would say the through line is communications have always been really important to me. When I think about as a kid, the classes that I loved the most, it was English. When I think about, what interested me in college, it was international relations and how countries, were able to engage with each other, how people were able, psychology, how people were able to really connect with one another. And then in terms of sort of the careers that I've had since then, it's been working in think tanks and teaching environments. And sort of the common thread again is that sense of how the stories that need to be told and reach the people by making it accessible to them and sort of using words as a powerful tool to translate those messages. So that's kind of the foundation. But the reality of why I started the business was I was coming from 3 years in agency. So I'd moved to London, I done my master's, and I started working in a public affairs company. And they did public relations, public affairs, and engaged with a lot of different companies across the sectors, a lot within the climate space, but broad range. That's the wonderful thing about agency life is you really touch upon every element of communications, but also so many different sectors. And while that was an incredible learning experience, I also realized that there were certain things I was noticing that I didn't feel where I was doing in the way that I wanted to be doing it. So to me, when I think about what matters in communications is nuance, is understanding sort of the nuances of the messages and being really intentional with what is being said. And that requires thinking and understanding a topic and not necessarily always being an expert, but devoting enough time to really grasp that essence. And I felt like in those environments, one of the things that was sometimes sacrificed by the nature of the world, which is very, very fast moving, is the time to really think through those issues in the way that I wanted to be thinking about them. And so that was something, an undercurrent that was frustrating me throughout my experience there. But if I'm being completely candid, I also comes from the fact that I burned out. It just was an environment that wasn't suited to who I am as a person. And there's a lot of reasons and a lot of reflections I had since that period. But for my own kind of well being, I had to take a step back and just pause. And it was in that process of pausing and sort of reevaluating what I liked and didn't like, what worked and what didn't work for me, that I kind of fell into entrepreneurship and started taking up some projects and sort of speaking honestly with old colleagues and people in the space and kind of formulating sort of mental frameworks of what I thought was a solution forward based on all the problems I was recognizing. And the product of that was thinking, okay, well, I'm talking about all the things that need to happen. Why don't I go ahead and do them and actually sort of put it into action?
Mhm. And I think that story is pretty similar to a lot of people that start their entrepreneurship journey. Like what you said of that you could look back on it and like craft a really pretty story, but it was just kind of like a bunch of things that happened that led you here. And I think burnout is definitely something that we all experience, whether we're entrepreneurs or whether we, work in more corporate setting. What do you think was one of the, like, main causes of your burnout at that time?
I think there is that element where, especially after university, we enter this path. And there's this sort of narrative, at least that I was telling myself of, okay, I just got to go do this. I got to keep going really fast, nonstop. And, that element of perfectionism in me being like, I have to be my best all the time, every single
Mhm.
moment and seize every opportunity. And that was my nervous system was inclined to see everything as a kind of, flight or fight risk. And
Threat, yeah.
so I was kind of with that mindset, that was already not predisposed to a high stress environment. Agencies in themselves are really fast moving, right? They are, you have to be current, you need to understand what's going on in the news, you have to be reacting, you have to be working with different clients and that service of them. And so that requires, just a lot of being able to cope with that level of stress. And I think that is something that I've realized is environments that people thrive in, but because of where I was and the pressures that I personally was putting on myself, it wasn't conducive to my well-being. I think in the world that we live in, a lot of people's self-worth is tied into their production and what they're creating, when at the end of the day, like, work is work. And that took me a lot to untangle because my self-worth was so wrapped into what I was achieving. And I think I need to take a step back from that.
Yeah. I definitely feel that. And I think that might be something that we also bring from going to the schools that we went to, right? Like, so they are also like Tufts was a great school, but definitely, pushed us all to be the best we could be academically, would put a lot of pressure on us. And then even like getting into a school like Tufts, right? Like you probably were experiencing that academic pressure. I know I was from like the age of 13, right? Like thinking about like what schools am I going to go to? So then you graduate and you do take that like super like the high intensity into your work because it's like, okay, what else are you going to put it in? And I think in some ways that does make us achieve really great things. But then after a while, you start to think, oh, like everything doesn't have to be super stressful, right?
Say 100%, it's a mindset, right? Where it's those things. And, especially for overachievers, we want to
Mhm.
succeed at all the time. But, it's how do we reframe it to make it sustainable for
Yeah.
everyone involved?
Yeah. And then tell me about this because you talked about you had to like untangle your identity a bit from your work to make it sure it's like not all wrapped up in one. But then you started your own business, right? And I think starting your own company, it is something that like I don't know, as much as I try to like separate my company from myself and like trust me, I absolutely love my company, but I know that like, in 10 years I might be doing something else. Like I'm not like as attached to it, I think, than I was at like 23. But I to be honest, it's still a big part of my identity. It's really hard to separate it. But then, okay, so you worked on untangling your identity from your work, and then you started your own company. Tell me a little bit more about how you think about your identity as a founder and also your identity as your own human being when looking into entrepreneurship because it is hard to separate.
No, that's a really good point. I think it's really fair. It's funny. I hadn't thought about it, but you're right. You're like, you say that, but then at the end of the day, when you start your own company fundamentally, and you're like, that's even, you're stuck with this really entangled in it. But I think what helped me was, again, that moment of pause, as it was woo, as it sounds. I took the time to think about what mattered to me, and what not just mattered, but what motivated me. So what got me out of bed in the day, what sparked joy, what were the elements of the job that I really enjoyed, and what did I want from my job? Like, what role did I want my job to have within the broader balance of my life? And I think being really intentional about thinking of that from the start allowed me then to sort of start this, and not get caught up in it and swept up in it. Because to me, for example, when I said to my life was my identity was tied into my work, was I really value being a team player. And so when I was in these companies, it was the sense of I never wanted to let anyone down. So to me, I would always give 100% um, at every task, right? And I think that I realized that that was just not sustainable. Like sometimes you give 70% and that's okay because that 70% will get you where you need to be that day as long as you show up every day. But
Mhm.
it's that consistency that is most important. And so I think taking that step back and realizing that I've been trying to apply it also into my own business. So for me now, I've realized, you know, I care about people. I love sort of speaking to people. That's one of the things I most enjoy about my business is like working with clients, helping them, being able to have that individual relationship. It's also knowing within that what gets me excited. And I think part of what really gets me excited is that sense of being really strategic in my work, being intentional with communicating and translating that message. And how do we do a job in a way that meets my own standards and I'm building for my own self, but also helping people in the process. So, I mean, kind of going a bit in a tangent, but to bring it back, it's the having asked myself those questions before diving in so that when I get a little bit lost or when I get consumed by a task, I can reground myself and take a step back and understand why I'm doing it. And I think that kind of applies to sort of what I end up recommending to a lot of the businesses I work for is having that North Star, having that mission really clear allows you to reroute and redirect yourself, even when and always when, because there is no clear path ever. So just being able to find your way back to the path that you need to go to.
Yeah. And I would say I completely agree with what you're talking about. And I would say one of the cool things about being an entrepreneur is it really does allow you to craft your why a lot better. And I think that's often something that causes burnout in like traditional corporate careers because you're not able to really act upon, why you're doing this and focus on the things that matter to you most. And then although, being an entrepreneur, your identity might be a little bit more closer to tied to what you're doing just because, you created this, you started this, there's a reason why you're doing it. You're able to craft your kind of like life in other ways. Like you said, you love talking to people, so you're able to make that a big part of what you do. And even like when I tell people who are thinking about starting their own businesses, like, yes, it's a lot of work, but you're able to craft your life in a way that ultimately is working towards something that's more enjoyable to you rather it is like being able to have time to volunteer or being able to have time to work on specific things that you're more interested in. And it's like it's a journey. It's not like you start your own business and immediately you're doing all the things that you love the most. But I think what makes it a lot more worthwhile and that it makes it a lot more enjoyable is that you're working towards a space where you're ultimately going to be doing more of the things that you feel passionate about.
Yeah, and I think it's so hard sometimes when you talk about passion and where, goal and mission is like that can be really abstract and hard to sort of pinpoint, right? Especially when we we kind of talk about it as this be all end all, like I'm saving the world, I am, eradicating. So I think breaking it down to also what does that mean to you? Like it doesn't need to be I'm solving climate change, but it's like I am doing my part to sort of help an issue that I care about, let's say. And how I do it is sort of reconciling what I'm good at, what my strengths are, and applying them in a way that also matches what I like doing. And so it's about sort of parceling out how it all fit within your day-to-day life. Um,
Mhm.
but 100%, I mean, asking yourself those questions is just the most important thing. And it evolves, right? I feel like when I through this process of building a business, like I started off with a very unclear idea and it always started taking shape as the months went on, as I started having those conversations. And I've had to pivot. I've added in more detail. You sort of start thinking about it, start crafting it as you go. Like you don't start off having all the answers at all. But but it's gratifying. I think when you're working for something outside of yourself, then it helps, right? It's not about you.
Mhm.
It's about an issue or person or a team that you care about. So that also helps you disentangle it from just you. And having a support system, whether it be your friends, other founders, your mentors, like that just helps you also bounce off ideas. And I think for founders and entrepreneurs, that's key. You get yourself out of your own silos in your own head.
Absolutely. And I want to go a little bit more into brand strategy and communications because I know when it came to myself when I was starting my own company, eventually when I went to raise capital or I was going to pitch competitions, the idea of like your why, your big why. Like, why do you do this? What is your mission? Like, all like your story, that kept on coming up so much. And at first I was like, this is kind of annoying because I definitely had my why, but I didn't have it in a way that I was easily able to communicate it to everyone, in a way that, people would fully understand why I started this company and then why we're doing what we're doing here over at WizKit Learning. And then I also from like, and I think this has definitely changed over the years, especially in the last 4 years. But at first, I didn't understand why it was important. I was like, we have amazing product. It does what it says it's going to do. It helps people. It helps students. It helps kids. Why do you care why I do what I do? Like, I thought it was just really quite annoying. And then as time went on, I realized why it's so important to be able to effectively communicate really your business's mission, what you do, why you do. And I also realized how hard it is to do that because, especially as a founder, everything makes sense in your head, right? But like it doesn't always make sense in your customer's mind, in your investor's mind, etc. So you're ultimately the expert at this because you are not just a, brand strategist, but you're also a founder as well too. So tell me a little bit about how you think entrepreneurs or people who are trying to craft their own career could first start looking at, their branding strategy, when it comes to their business.
I think you raised such a good point, which is the even understanding the value of it, right? Why does strategy matter? What is the point of it? And you went through that through your own business, which is that doesn't matter. But at the end of the day, the reason I see it almost as the foundation, the architecture, from which everything else can build. And if there's a very fragile architecture, then the minute pressures start kind of coming in, then the brand faces an existential crisis. Whereas if you have a really strong foundation, that means you can continue to grow. And even if it goes into different directions, it always has that centered core piece that attaches all of those activities, products, services, and links them together. So yes, and strategy, I mean, I feel passionate about this is core, especially understanding what your brand is, what it represents, what you want it to be, and where you want it to go. And I think one of the things that I've thought through or kind of honed through the process of working agency and seeing different companies and working with companies at different stages is almost a framework for how to unlock that. So a lot of times companies come to you like, okay, yes, like can you just write us a social post or like let's do a communications bit? And I'm like, okay, but what are you trying to say and why? Right. And so starting at the end of that funnel is really hard for communications experts because you're almost retroactively trying to build and understand what that sort of communication is. But that's a tactic, that's a tool that you're using. But before you can activate the tools, you need to have your manuscript, your narrative, your story, your essence, your fur, call it what you want, your core. And so the way I would recommend brands and companies work through this is to start first at the very beginning with thinking about their brand strategy, not their communication strategy, not how you're going to talk about what you want to do, but what do you represent? Who are you? What is your mission? Why do you exist? What problem are you trying to solve in the market and why? Why does your company exist at this moment right now? And how is it different from other companies in the market? These questions, which are so simple, when you start kind of asking them, a lot of different perspectives come out. And so that entire process of hashing out the differences and points of view and sort of finding a consensus, even within teams, I think really unravels that core essence of why a company exists and what it seeks to achieve. And then once you've unlocked that piece, then it's about sort of crafting the narrative around it, telling that story in a way that doesn't just make sense to the founder, but actually resonates with the people that it needs to. So that's the narrative element of it. So the first one's that kind of strategy piece. How do you
Yeah.
stand out? The next piece is the narrative, which is how do you then communicate it to the people you need to communicate it to?
hmm When it comes to entrepreneurs, do you think this is something that is best done like right when they're starting the company? Or do you think this is something that should be done, you know, a little while in? And I think it will probably change industry from industry to industry. But I think in the beginning, I did have a strong why I'm doing this, but it was a very like high level why. Like my why was just that, you know, I started a club at Tufts that helped get women and minorities jobs in corporate America. And one of the things that we saw is if you had any STEM background or engineering background, you were getting jobs a lot quicker. And I found this very unfair. And then I looked at the stats and I saw that, wow, like the tech industry is growing, but it's not very diverse. And normally students don't go towards STEM unless they've had some like strong exposure to it at a young age. So that was my big why for starting the company. But then as time went on, I realized like that why wasn't completely strong enough and I needed to make it more strategic. But I always wondered if I would have thought about the why a little bit in a more strategic way. And honestly, like I was 20 or 21 when starting my company. So I don't even think I really understood even what brand strategy was. It would have been a lot easier for me to craft a story and direction of my company. But in your opinion, like should they really start thinking about like brand strategy?
I mean, in ideal worlds, right? That's something that comes at the start. When you build the company, you have those conversations, you think about them. And you did to some extent. It sounds like you
Yeah.
did ask your questions. But the reality is, businesses move fast. Startups are they're racing against other competitors, and sometimes it just seize the moment. And there's all these competing priorities, and a lot of the time, it's hard to be that bouncing wall to yourself when you're a small
hmm
team and one or two. So I've worked with a lot of startups that their core focus is solving the issue, finding the technology, understanding the needs of their customers, and so there's so many competing priorities that I understand why perhaps it doesn't feel like the utmost priority. What I'll say is that it can exist in tandem, and I think that it's important to have that as early on in the process as possible because it's it not only guides where you're going, but it gets people on board. So if
hmm
you're even a small team, if everyone understands why they're there and has a common mission and common vision, it makes you invested. It makes you sort of feel that camaraderie with your people. So from an internal communications perspective, it glues you together. And then from an external communications perspective, it allows you to be saying the same thing, even if it's in slight derivations to different audiences, you're honing in the same point. And that allows you to really amplify your impact because when you think about companies that fail, a lot of the times it's because there wasn't that clarity. It wasn't firm, it wasn't strong. They didn't really know, or they weren't able to communicate in a way that told other people that they were valuable, right? So especially at the very beginning when you're trying to sell your idea to other people and get investment and get funding and sort of run off the runway. Yeah, I think that it's fundamental to have that strategy in place as
hmm
early on as possible.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I would say when I figured out my why and I had to sit down and really, really think about like my why as a founder, the bigger impact that the company wants to make, I was like, the company completely transformed and we were able to grow a lot quicker because we had that cohesive mission. One thing I want to talk to you about, and I was actually quite excited to ask you questions about this because we are seeing the rise of like the founder as also the brand of the company or having their own brand in tandem with their company. And I remember when I first started seeing this, it was like, I was like graduating high school and I started to notice that like a lot of founders were becoming brands. I think we saw it with like, I don't know if you know Nasty Gal, the clothing brand. And then she had like a show called Girl Boss. And she was one of the ones that we first started seeing. We saw it with even like, I think her name is Emily, the founder of, oh my gosh, Glossier. We saw it with that as well
Mhm.
too. And at first I was like, this is such a bad idea because I was like, if people end up not liking you, they're not going to like your company. And at first I was quite cynical about it. I was like, this just seems quite risky. And then my tune changed like a while ago, actually, but I realized that a lot of companies were growing exponentially because their founder also was closely tied to the brand or had a like brand. In some cases, it was all mixed up in one. Like there was no separation between the brand and the founder and brand, which, we've definitely seen that to be problematic, but we've also seen that to be able to help grow companies so quickly. So when you're thinking about like brand strategy and also like founders as brands, I was wondering, do you have any opinions around that? Or even any thoughts about that? Because I would think that would come up a lot eventually, especially with startup founders.
Absolutely. I think we are entering kind of an era where that personal brand is really leaking into corporate brand and they are enmeshed in a way that is fundamentally intertwined, interlocked, and codependent, right? When you go on LinkedIn, you don't really care about what corporate companies are saying. You're looking at the CEO and what conversations they're engaging in. And you're looking at the faces behind the company, what does the team look like? What are they saying? How is the community engaging? And so to me, my take on that is the the desire for authenticity. I think we're at in this post-truth world where AI is also all the rage and sort of information overload we've got so much content and we're rated. We just want to feel seen and we want to relate to the brands that we buy, consume, trust. We want to trust what we're buying, what we're hiring. We want to know that aligns with our values and with our way of living. And so I think that the rise of the personal founder brand is kind of a reaction to that desire for authenticity, for that desire of being seen and seeing someone behind the actual business. And it's almost that link between being sold something and trusting that it's actually going to deliver on kind of our expectations for that brand. And we can hold those people accountable, whereas this sort of faceless entity is not something that we can engage with as personally with. So it is critical. And I think that, as you've said, like that is now being shown across social channels. And so many brands are emerging from TikTok. And it's because the marketing behind it is so personal and they're not just selling a product or a service. They're selling a lifestyle, a brand that is telling a story that is hooking people. And I think that, that's seen a lot in the consumer worlds, but when we take it also to the corporate worlds, it can be applied, right? If it's because it's about that storytelling piece, right? It's not about what this business is doing. It's who are you serving? What problem are you solving? And why can we trust you? Where are you the most qualified to be solving that problem? If you think about climate tech startups, what makes your team qualified and what's your story? How did you start? Like we want those narratives. We're craving them, especially because it allows us to like piece through the noise and actually, you know, listen. It's really cluttered out there. So it's hard to get focused.
And as a brand strategist, would you suggest founders start to brand themselves while branding their company? Like, is it something that you think we should all be thinking about from day one? Or do you think that's something that like comes after the company has a cohesive, distinct brand? What's your thoughts about that?
It really depends. I think there's some people who are very comfortable being the face of a company and sort of being involved. There are other people who want to be sort of more protected by the broader entity and they don't need their own selves to have that much of a social presence. What I will say is from a startup perspective, so an early stage company, the founder presence is essential
Mhm.
because you're getting investors to bet on you and your idea and why you are going to be the one to take it to the next level. So being able to build that credibility, whether it's through a kind of powerful social presence or through one-to-one engagement that inspires that confidence, it is essential. And I think that your personal brand doesn't need to be the most curated feed, or it doesn't need to be posting every other second. It's about knowing what you stand for, knowing what channels you're investing in, knowing why you're investing in those channels, and what message, and being really clear about the messages that you are trying to communicate and how they tie into your broader objective. I think when I do the exercise of unlocking sort of the brand strategy behind companies and startups, it's asking the questions: what are your objectives, both from a business perspective and communications perspective? Who are your audiences? Who are you trying to reach? And what are you trying to have them understand? What are you trying to say to them? And once you have those three sort of pieces clear, then it becomes easier to sort of carve out a path forward. I don't think there's a one size fits all for a personal brand. But I think that especially from a CEO level, from a kind of startup level as well, it's essential to have that presence in some way or another.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it could be very overwhelming starting a company. So definitely having to think of your brand strategy is important, but then thinking about yourself as a brand could be a bit overwhelming. But I do definitely think it's something that could be incredibly helpful from the beginning. Like I think all the most successful startups, a lot of them have founders who are closely tied to the brand or at least have like a clear position of, how their why interacts with the company's why. And one of the things that we spoke about earlier before we even started recording this episode is the idea of unlocking, building, and like protecting your brand. I think you used those three words, which I really, really loved. And for somebody who is starting their company or has maybe even been an entrepreneur for a couple years but have not thought about like brand strategy, I think we talked a lot about the unlocking part of it, thinking about like the why, what you do, why you do it, what are your missions, and then thinking about like building and then protecting that. What are some tips that you have that entrepreneurs could take away that could help them build and then also protect their brand? Because I think oftentimes what gets missed too is that we as entrepreneurs realize, okay, we have to have a why. We got the why. And then we forget to integrate that into our company culture, how we do things, how we hire, how we, create marketing, who's in our marketing. We think, okay, we have a mission, that's enough. But talk a little bit about the building and protecting aspect of it, and then just like maybe some ways we could just keep that front of mind so that we could protect that brand that we work so hard to build.
That's okay. Thank you for bringing it up, because 100% that was sort of the two elements of the framework that I was missing, so that we can kind of tie them all together. And it actually ties in, just to bring it back to the sort of personal brand bit. That's actually the building and protecting is also a really important piece here, because you don't necessarily just need to have the social presence, but you have to be aware of the reputational risk, right? If you are, for example, a CEO at a company that is all about sustainability and you're posting sort of your political views and sort of supporting causes that don't align to that, that is going to hurt your business, or that is going to be pointed out by journalists or scrutiny. Like, basically, we live in a very consumers and people at large want transparency, great transparency, and information is out there. So we do need to be careful about what we're saying and making sure that it is aligned with what we're doing, because that will be called out if not. So bringing it back to kind of building and unlocking and tips, that in a tip is a tip in itself, is just making sure that, you audit your company, your people, and make sure that it is aligned with what you stand for, and that, your social activities, but also your day-to-day activities aren't in conflict with the business that you're trying to sell. So when I think about, the sort of stages of brand strategy, we talked about unlocking, sort of understanding the why and building that narrative. The building element to me is sort of the communications part. You know what you're doing now. How do you get it out into the world? And that can take on many forms. It can be a campaign. It's sort of the short term. It's the short term activations that allow you to really get that message out there. And I guess some tips for that is one of them is be really clear about what channels you want to be investing in. You don't need to be on TikTok and LinkedIn and Instagram. It's exhausting. There's so much going out in social media. It's changing every single day. And trying to do it all, the spray and pray tactic, is just not going to work. So it's about really knowing, okay, who do you want to reach and what platform is going to be most effective? And then making sure your resources and your energy is clearly targeted towards that channel. I would say another tip within that building framework, which is sort of knowing builds in this case, by builds, I mean kind of building your brand, growing your brand through communications that reach the audiences that you want to reach. And another way to do that is thinking about how you cut through the noise. How do you stand out in a crowded market? So ways to really succeed at that is look at your competitors, look at who's doing it well and look at who's not doing it well. Look at what messaging they're saying and how can you differentiate your messaging from what they're doing. Um, and take some risks. Like I think that in the corporate world, it is a little bit more, there's a lot of hesitancy. Sometimes there's a lot of red tape around things, press releases get whittled down to mean nothing. Um, and I think that we need to be creative, especially with the stories that we're telling. We need to move people to actually act. We need to inspire them. And that requires getting creative and thinking about sort of ways to be people to like actually do something. And I think that sort of consumer brands sometimes do a really good job because they, let's say Duolingo, they get quirky, they have a
Yeah.
tone, there's this consistency of importance, and they're funny.
Mm.
And I think a lot of times corporate companies miss out on that because first of all, the topics that they're trying to tackle are very complex. So I think that's one of the things that I find really, I'm very passionate about is some of the most important issues in our time are complex issues without silver bullets. We're not just selling shoes. We are trying to get policies passed for climate solutions that might take years, that have a lot of nuances and they're really complex and there's a lot of controversy around it. Or education policies that are that there's a lot of points of views around them. And so you need to make that digestible. And with at the same time, not sacrificing nuance. So it's a challenge, but it's possible. And it's possible because there's incredible minds behind it. And we just need to infuse some of those incredibly technical, smart, accurate ideas with some inspiration and creativity and create this wonderful hailstorm to actually move the needle in the direction we need to. So I think there's a lot of learnings that we can bring from other industries into the more, I would say, kind or slow moving industries.
Yeah. I would think like impact focused businesses definitely have that problem as well too, because we are tackling issues that are so close to our heart and so important. And a lot of times we feel that they're like life or death for the lack of better words. But, we could infuse some of those like human elements and some of those elements that not corporate, consumer brands, like you said, are able to use in order to better communicate what we're doing to our customers and ultimately get more people on board. One of the last questions I want to ask you, and I think this really pertains to everyone, and it's really just a question about you, just like as an entrepreneur who has found themselves on this journey of starting their own company. Is there any advice you would give to anyone who, is might coming from a more corporate background and thinking about jumping off and doing something themselves? Because I think that's something that a lot of our listeners think about. And also, just like a lot of our friends and families, they all have business ideas that sometimes they've thought about going into, but might have just never found the right time. Any advice or anything that you've learned from being an entrepreneur that you will want to pass along?
So many things, but to winnow it down to one, I would say, it's back to that word, and I keep saying it with that sense of intentionality, and taking the time to think about yourself, what sparks joy for you, and what you're good at. Because once you know this is what I really care about, or these are some of the things I really care about. And as a generalist, I feel like that's the hardest question to ask because I find everything interesting. Curious
Same.
about all these things. So for other generalists out there, I know it's not easy and it takes a lot of experimentation. So try it out, right? Do things. That's
Mhm.
why I think it's really hard in the early stages of your career to have it all together. I think a lot of people say they do and they absolutely don't. So don't get sort of discouraged by what you're seeing out there. Like there's so many twists and turns that people will take before they figure it out. And no one ever has it figured out. But a way to, I think, kind of get closer to that answer, and with the caveat that that answer might change, is think about kind of the early days. What did you like to do as a kid? Like, did you read a lot? Did you play with your friends? Did you build things? Like sometimes we get so lost in the day to day and what we should be doing and what we think other people want us to do that we sort of quiet the inner voice that is actually guiding us in the direction it needs to be going. So maybe try and unlock some of those. So some of those clues for yourselves by bringing it back to the basic. And then thinking also not just what do you get excited about, but what are you good at? Like what have people told like complimented you on and your people who know you and your friends and your family? What are some pieces of feedback that not only that make you feel proud? Like when you hear that feedback and you're like, oh, you're a really good communicator. Oh, like you're so good at building things. Like if that sparks pride, that's probably like a sign that that's something that you should be doing more of.
Mhm.
So I guess like to kind of bring it together is listen to those clues, be open to exploring things so that you can get more data to be able to unravel those things. And then once you have them, go for it. You know, I think we get really stuck in that, I don't know if there's this path. And if I get off it, like I won't be able to get back on it. And there's so many risks and it's scary out there. And like it is, I mean, nothing's guaranteed. And the only thing that is that you are carving your own path and that you, as long as you are intentional with what you're doing and excited about it, it's not going to be a mistake because you're going to learn
Mhm.
and you're going to grow from it. Right.
Wow.
To go for it.
That was that was excellent. I definitely think there's a lot of clues from our childhood on what we should be doing and what our passions are about. So I really love that. And thank you so much for joining me today. I feel like I took so much away, even myself, about brand strategy and like even continuously thinking about what we're doing at my company because I know it's not something that you put out once, you create your why and then you leave it. It's something that you have to continue to keep on doing. Where can people find you if they want to work with you or want to learn more about you?
Actually, well, my website is www.adrianaguardansgodo.com, but also you can find me on LinkedIn and DM me or find my email on that website. Just reach out, DM me. I mean, I'm very excited to work with impact-driven businesses and tell their stories. So if you've got a story, let's talk.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Congo. This was lovely. Love chatting.
Okay, guys, thank you so much. I really hope you enjoyed that episode. I know I did. I really cannot stress this enough. Finding your why and effectively communicating your story, your brand identity to your customers is so important. It's something that goes overlooked a lot, and it's something that you need to do from the beginning. So, definitely check out Adriana's website. It's in the show notes if you want help with that. And please make sure to like this podcast, subscribe to it. If you're watching it on YouTube, send it to 5 friends. And I look forward to having you guys listen next week. And if there's anything that you want me to cover in these episodes, please reach out to me on Instagram, DM me. I always respond back, and I really want this to be as helpful for all of you. So I would love to hear you guys' feedback. Thank you so much and have a good rest of your week.